All right, so we're here with Doug Moore. Doug is the vocalist in the bands Pyrrhon, Sexiest, and Weeping Sores, and looking forward to chatting about a bunch of stuff. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, you may know that I start these podcasts off by just asking about people's coffee habits, and so I'd love to know if you drink coffee or if there's any other sort of sacred beverage in your world.
Yes, I do enjoy coffee and drink quite a lot of it. Um, I drink mostly in colder months, such as now. I drink typically drip coffee made with like a Cuisinart like coffee pot that you can program because I like to have it available to me the instant I get out of bed. When it's warmer, I drink mostly iced coffee. We have this big like air brewing carafe thing for iced coffee where you can um, put it into like a sieve in the top of the carafe and has a little like raindrop simulator like grill on it, so it evenly distributes the water when you pour the water over it, and it cold brews on the counter, and then you can put it in the fridge overnight. That's how we stock ourselves with coffee in the morning when it's warmer out. I also enjoy espresso and americano. When I go to a coffee shop, I often get an americano, but it's a little bit too much work for me to do that at home.
For sure.
Um, and yeah, I usually drink a couple mugs in the morning and then usually one in the afternoon to keep me going. And the less I sleep, the more of it I drink. It's a pretty big part of my life. I wouldn't say that I have any special knowledge of it in the sense of like a connoisseur or anything like that, but I do really enjoy it and rely on it to get through the
For sure.
day, as so many do.
Is that the iced coffee craft thing? Is that like the Filtron or one of those things? Like is a
Uh,
white thing?
No, I don't. I can't recall the brand name of it. It's basically like a sort of hourglass shaped.
Okay.
There is a like a big plastic skirt into which you put the carafe, and it when you put the carafe inside of it, it opens a little mechanism that allows the
Okay.
water to drain down through. And if the carafe's not there, it doesn't drip; it just sits.
Gotcha.
Um, so um, so that's on the bottom of it, and the top of it, there's kind of this like inverted cone shaped container that you put the coffee grinds into, and then there's a sort of a filter that sits on top of that. It's raindrop simulator thing. So the concept is that you pour the water into it through the filter, and then it just sits in this upper area, steeping effectively overnight. And then in the morning, you decant it into this carafe that sits beneath it, and it's automatically locked until you put the carafe in there. So you kind of just pop it in there and like it opens effectively. And then you put it into the fridge. It's a black and clear piece of plastic,
Okay.
but I can't tell you what the brand is at the top of my head.
Would you say that the other guys in Pyrrhon are also coffee drinkers or like serious, regular coffee drinkers at least?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Uh, I and our guitarist at one point actually, in fact, worked in a restaurant together where we were often both behind the bar, so we'd both be making the espresso drinks and it was like a kind of like a shishi soup and sandwich place. So there were a lot of often very complicated espresso drinks that we were cranking out in large numbers. And certainly that was a very caffeinated time in our lives because we would just drink it, of course, at the same time because you're running around, you kind of want the energy anyway.
Totally.
Um, so yeah, I'd say all four of us are pretty enthusiastic coffee consumers, and certainly when we're on tour, there's a mandatory coffee stop before we go start driving in the morning. Like we don't leave until we get the coffee; it's required. So
Cool. Well, that gives me a good window into who y'all are. I've only had like one person that has not consumed coffee, and it's a strange conversation to have at that point. Um, anyway, let's talk about music though. So Pyrrhon's been together since 2008, right?
yes, that's right.
So I feel like there's this trend, maybe in metal and all sorts of genres, in addition, where like the sort of in real life band is veering more and more towards just like nerds alone at home in a room with some MIDI files. And so,
Right.
what does it keep to sustain like a real life in person band of multiple humans?
Well, it's definitely not the most convenient or efficient way to make music
Hmm.
nowadays. Uh, Basically, the most important factor. in sustaining something like that is having like a positive interpersonal dynamic,
For
because
sure.
if you don't want to be around each other, then you will not make these sacrifices required to engineer that situation over and over again. Especially, as time goes on, Pyrrhon's been a band for coming up on, I mean, I guess it's 14 years this year now.
Yeah.
Um, and our lives have changed quite substantially since the band started. The membership is not the same, but it's 3 out of 4 of us from the second year of the band. So,
Hmm.
and the fourth guy is someone who I've known for even longer, actually. Um, so, as time goes on, people's lives pull them in different directions, and you just have to be willing to prioritize making the time and space in your life to get together. In order to do that, it helps a lot if you're like really good friends. And, fortunately in the band, we have a pretty strong, positive internal dynamic that makes us want to get together and do something. And it so happens that we're in this band together. Um, but other than that, a lot of it's just been luck, honestly.
Hmm.
We've all been like we've had a sufficient number of people in the same place with the ability to do that kind of thing together, um, because no one has been forced to move very far away or has gotten some other kind of career opportunity that they are so invested in they decide they want to deprioritize the band. And I think in a lot of bands that kind of thing happens from time to time, and usually you can, if the core lineup is still stable, you can add a new person to do it. In the case of Pyrrhon, what we're doing is very specific, so it would be challenging to. I mean, at this point in the band, like no one can really be replaced. Where our roles are all too bespoke, I guess. So I'm not sure what happened if that were to occur. I mean, it's possible we would just be like, well, we'll stop, or we'll start doing a
Hmm.
different thing, like. So yeah, I mean, it hasn't been schematic. There hasn't been a plan to keep the band together. But when I reflect on why it's lasted when some other bands didn't, it's a combination of those factors, I would say.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Um, in terms of like rehearsing and stuff, can you walk me through some of like the practical elements? Like, is there like a space, like do you rent a space, or do like meet a certain frequency?
Yeah, we have a practice space in the old fashion of bands,
Yeah.
and we under normal circumstances we usually meet um, once a week or once every other week most of the time. During the COVID period, that's been disrupted, and we've gone for long periods without practicing. But when something is coming up, we'll reconvene. Um, uh, assuming that everybody is healthy and able to do so.
For sure.
Um, so that's been a little bit disrupted, but usually I would say we've been practicing once or twice a week for most of that stretch, or well, not once or twice a week, once every week or so for most of that stretch. Occasionally twice a week if there's a recording coming up or something like that. Um, and the band's homes are a little spread out. Our drummer Steve actually lives in Philly, and the other three of us live in different boroughs. I live in Queens. Dylan, our guitarist, lives in Manhattan, and Eric, our bassist, lives in Brooklyn. So it's a bit of a schlep to get us all together. Practice is usually pretty long when we do rehearse. It's
Hmm.
usually like a 3+ hour practice.
Right.
We take breaks and stuff because you can't play that kind of material constantly for that
For sure.
duration. But yeah, so it's a pretty big time investment to do it. For Steve especially, driving from Philly. Typically, sometimes the train, but typically he drives. Um, and so we try to make our time count. We take breaks, but we don't dick around very much. It's usually pretty focused.
Hmm.
Our practice space is quite small and cramped also, so there's not a lot of incentive to just like sit around and like not be working. Like when we're
For
in
sure.
there, we're going pretty hard usually. It has no cell phone reception, so you like kind of in this box, like you can't contact the outside world, which I kind of like actually.
Hmm.
And I think that the whole experience in some ways lends itself to the kind of pressurized or like kind of claustrophobic sound that we're evoking in that band. So it has a certain like poetic resonance for me in that way.
Nice. And is this the practice space I've seen like little snippets of y'all practicing on Instagram?
Yeah. If you see pictures of us like standing way too close together and like our guitars are like up because you
Yeah.
can't, so they don't hit somebody. Yeah, it's that room. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm out here in LA, and I feel like that type of thing would be enough to discourage people from like. I mean, people in LA are always looking for excuses to not like go to what they planned on doing. So, that space is. I admire y'all for doing that. um,
honestly, I think that the time is coming in the very near future where we're going to try to move to a different room. It's a little bit bigger because I think we've all kind of we we we've composed um, and subsequently toured on now two full lengths in that room. So we've been in there for I think a little over 5 years now, and um, we've pretty much had enough punishment when it comes to standing that close together and sweating quite that much when we're playing, kind of not being able to turn around and stuff. Um, but um, but it definitely left its mark on the material that we were working on, I think, during that period.
Gotcha. Yeah, I saw a comment that was like, "I can smell this room from here," and
Yeah,
it's just funny.
it's
Um,
gross. Like they're not wrong. It's definitely pretty greasy in there. So
so I feel like one of the most common things I'll see when somebody writes a review of anything from Pyrrhon is like calculated, or like I feel like people almost want to say like jazzy a lot, and like calculated. Like I guess I get that sense, but like I also feel like there's something very organic and collaborative that I'm hearing, without even like knowing really that much about the process of writing. Does the term calculated seem to resonate with you, or does that seem off base?
yeah, I mean, well, certainly, I don't think that we're jazzy. We as people and fans, we all like jazz to one degree or another.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think there really is a whole lot of actual jazz in our music.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and so that one I always kind of laugh at because it's jazz being used in this like Spinal Tap way, just to describe like complicated like cerebral music that the listener does not enjoy. Uh, but as far as calculated, there's kind of a balance of the sort of like the Apollonian and Dionysian, you might say, in the band,
Okay.
in the sense that there are some parts that are very structured and very pointillistic and have lots of little intricacies that are planned and that are like drilled and rehearsed to the point where we can do them at high speed in a way that sounds relatively smooth, hopefully. Um, so, and there's a lot of thought that goes into the overall product in terms of the effect that we're trying to achieve and the aesthetic and the lyrics and all those things. So, in many ways, it's a calculated band in the sense that it's not super duper spontaneous or tossed off or anything like that. And there is a fair amount of rigor involved in achieving it. But there is also, I think, a very freewheeling and like literally improvisational
Hmm.
element to the band in the sense that we do actually straight up do free improvisation in the band. And in a lot of cases, even within a very tightly structured part rhythmically, the note choices will be arbitrary or improvised effectively, so that there is like a rhythmic sense of tightness and precision, but there's an unpredictable harmonic
Hmm.
content to it. Um, and in general, I feel like there is also just a certain kind of um, maniac, off the cuff energy to the way that we perform as players. I don't think any of us are very tight, clinical, school sounding musicians at any of what we're playing. I think that there's a lot of chops involved in what we're doing, but it's not that kind of chops. I don't think.
Hmm.
And so in that sense, there is a lot of um, sort of adhocracy in Pyrrhon in a way, a lot of um, getting things done the way that you can get them done, whatever that may be.
Right.
Um, and so in that sense, when people say calculated, I think that there is a subtext of like precision or like clinicality that I really don't think that we possess whatsoever and couldn't even if we wanted to. It's just not who we are. So in that sense, I see where people are coming from. What they're trying to say is that it's technical and sounds complicated
Uh-huh.
usually, which it is and it does. That's not wrong, but definitely there is a lot of just like wildness, I think, in our music that flies in the face of that choice of words.
Gotcha. Yeah, and yeah, I was talking to Nick McMaster about this idea of technicality, and like he doesn't really like that term, and I don't either. But I mean, Pyrrhon is obviously technical, but it doesn't seem like it's like let me show you how good I am at my instrument. What do you think the motivation is to create or like technical stuff, or like what is a better word than technical?
Yeah, I see what you mean about the term technical, because that that word has a lot of preloading even prior to the music context, and it gets even more loading in the music context, and it becomes very hard to really interrogate what someone's saying when it's technical. I mean,
Yeah.
there's all kinds of different possible overtones to this term technical. Um, uh, and it's funny that you mentioned Nick in that sense, because he's in some bands that are like very cerebral and heady in some ways. Obviously, a lot of the Krallice material is uh, super composed sounding and has this like almost borderline classical feel to it. But there's also the Krause material that's super naughty and has a similar kind of disorienting complexity to it. And these other sort of side bands are like that too. And yeah, so I think what for us, the reason that we tend to make complicated stuff is to achieve like a more general aesthetic effect of being um, overwhelmed or
Hmm.
dizzied or disoriented or kind of taken on a ride that you can't control, right? It's supposed to achieve an emotional effect. That doesn't always translate for everybody. Obviously, a lot of people find any kind of complexity of that sort to feel very clinical. Um, but I guess that for the term that I would refer to here, used to describe the approach to sort of the chopsy musicianship stuff in the band. Um, I think of it as being very, very frantic,
Hmm.
or sort of wild, I guess. Uh, it's hard for me to over determine other people's word choices in this way, because all these words are very. Anytime you use these kind of things to describe music, it's metaphorical, and it's not only a metaphor for the sound of the music; it's a metaphor for what it makes you feel.
Hmm.
So, um, technical is just one of those words that has that kind of like music writer shorthand for a bunch of assumptions thing, and
Right.
that's the reason it bugs me more, especially when you combine it with death metal, because say technical death metal, there's a lot of death metal that is technical that people, but when you say technical death metal, there's this kind of certain aesthetic sheen to it that is common to a lot of very archetypal like popular bands in that style. The tech death thing, right?
Hmm.
Which I think is being different from death metal that is technical, and so like for me, the reason that word's kind of uncomfortable is because it's collapsing all of this stuff into that, and it always just feels a little bit derogatory, in the sense that you were saying, where it's borderline synonymous, even with people who like it, with like flashiness or like showiness for the sake of like demonstrating technique in this kind of like DVD player way,
Hmm.
and that's really super not what we're about as a band, I don't think so.
Gotcha. These are sort of an arbitrary, collection of words, but would you feel like chaos or complicatedness or complexity? Does one of those best describe what the goal is?
Yeah, I think that in the case of Pyrrhon, sort of the sense of chaos or kind of like rhythmic free fall is more closer to what we're trying to achieve, but not and sometimes to the point of actual literal randomness, like I was saying earlier,
Hmm.
but not to the point where you can't engage with it, not to an academic extent, and for me at least, the intention with Pyrrhon is always to be uh, evoking some kind of emotional response more than a intellectual one.
Gotcha.
That's the part of the band that I cherish the most, and I think it's fair to say it's the part that we prioritize or at least value most highly, of the things that our music can achieve. Um, Pulling off like an impressive intellectual feat um, is not really what we're after. I
Right.
mean, if that happens along the way, then cool, but it's not. It's not. We're not motivated by the attempt to solve like a uh, compositional conundrum or something like that, or
Hmm.
forge new territory in that way. It's more about something that's gut level, I would say.
Okay, so there's no like number crunching that's really or like high level geekery.
I mean, sometimes those things get deployed for the like for nuts and bolts compositional
Hmm.
purposes, right? We don't notate very much. We try to keep our stuff as like oral tradition-y as we can because that kind of caps how ridiculous you can get with it in a way that I think that we all kind of like, just in the sense of not getting lost too far up our own asses, you know.
For sure, yeah.
Um, um, but sometimes we use more like sort of songwriting rules or schema to like produce interesting effects, in terms of just sequencing and structuring an overall song. There was one there's one song on our most recent record, Abscess Time, where the structure is symmetrical, basically. Uh, it's not strictly this, but the way that it's structured is there's like an A part, a C part, and then a D part, and then it goes back. The D part is kind of relatively short sort of loop that is pretty balanced in terms of like the melodic contour. And then from there, it goes back to the C part, but the C part is kind of rearranged in reverse, and then the B part is kind of rearranged with the original B part, and so forth with the A part. So it's kind of this symmetrical shape in terms of the structure. But that's not really a dominant element of the band doing that kind of thing. It's just like, oh, I wonder if we can write a song like this. There is an element of like play and exploration in the band for finding new ways to generate ideas. There's some other stuff in the same album where the rule is basically like no writing outside the room, and
Interesting.
no core guitar riff. They ended up being a couple songs where basically it's all predicated on a very repetitive bass and drum groove that where all of the complexity is like vertical. It's all like layering and adding stuff on top of it, and the rhythm section and some aspects of the guitar are like very static throughout them. Um, so we like to do stuff like that just to encourage ourselves to write different kinds of songs, um, but that's more like a way of getting ourselves into the right kind of writing space to maybe achieve some of the emotional effects that we're the most interested in.
Gotcha. Interesting. With that rule of not writing outside of the room, does that mean that like the riffs are purely maintained in your heads, or are there ever like voice memo recordings of guitar riffs or um, anything like
It's
that?
it's more in contrast to like the typical way that Pyrrhon songs are initiated, which is usually with one person writing some stuff on one instrument, typically guitar. All four of the members of the band can play guitar,
Cool.
and so uh, typically everyone except for Eric, our bassist, will write on guitar. Eric has written on bass sometimes. The others of us have maybe thrown some ideas in bass there in a similar fashion, but it's mostly been that way. Um, but there's a lot of modification and sort of collective development and adding improvisational segments and stuff like that that happens with the songs after one person originates them. But in that sense, having a song where there's just literally no writing at all outside of the room, it's all conceived through sort of the group dynamic and group improvisation and group iteration. That sets it apart. We record our practices quite a lot. Typically, it is just like a crappy cell phone recording, um, and which can be very grisly to listen to, even more so than just the actual sound of the band, which is substantial. But they do allow us to like at least like reflect on what worked and what didn't. So there's a lot of iteration takes place that way, playing the songs together, recording them, listening back to them, seeing what details came through, what didn't. Um, One nice thing about working in that fashion is that um, the crappiness of the cell phone recording and like the very harsh way that the sound is inside that tiny room, these big amps all kind of blasting into the center of the
Hmm.
room, is that um, you find out what's going to get lost live. You find out like,
Interesting.
okay, like, this part is not going to translate whatsoever live. It's just going to sound weak or not punch through. Um, and to the extent that's possible, we like to have everyone share the sonic space when we're playing a song live. And being a relatively small time band, we're often playing in pretty unfriendly audio environments, just shitty bars and basements and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um, so it's kind of an interesting stress test to see what like a cell phone recording of a song can capture because it often will reveal that something isn't really standing up to the rest of what's going on, or that something's overpowering the rest of the instrumentation in some way. Um, so it can be, yeah. So that's like kind of a side benefit of this, um, but even for the stuff that we write in the room, there's a lot of this listening back to what we've been working on.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay. Um, I guess like it seems like the mission statement in some ways, and maybe calling it a mission is silly, but like the idea of like expanding the definition of heavy metal. I'm curious. Besides, say, Gore Guts, who would you consider as doing this currently?
Um, who is expanding the definition of heavy metal? That is that the quote that's on Wikipedia?
Something like that on Wikipedia. I thought it was maybe on the Bandcamp too, but I saw that
Okay.
a few times.
Yeah, yeah. There's this quote on Wikipedia from an interview that I gave in like probably almost 10 years ago now, where
Mhm.
like that was kind of like the idea at the time. And that was true sort of more in the early days of the band before we realized that questions of genre like that aren't like, I mean, frankly, they're just not that really interesting to me.
Yeah.
I do think there's some bands that are doing interesting things around the margins of like extreme metal, especially. Um, a project that comes to mind, I'm sure you're familiar with, is Jude Geit.
Mhm.
Um, you
Great.
still there? You
Yeah,
froze
I
for a
am. Yeah,
second.
you froze up too, but I heard you. Jute Kite, you're
Okay,
talking about?
yeah. Okay, I think it's yeah. It's sorry. The audio and the video are getting synced back up. You know when it freezes, it like slowly catches up.
Totally. Yeah.
All right. Anyway, you can edit that out in post. Fix it in post. Fix it in post. Okay. So yeah. So one example is that project Jute Geit,
Hmm.
who and you know that guy's doing a lot of interesting things with I'm not sure if I'm describing this accurately, but it seems like he's procedurally generating compositions to some extent, using a lot of rules that are from like the Western classical repertoire. Like I know he likes to work with canons a lot and stuff like that, but it's all very like computation oriented. He's like just like bouncing numbers off each other and kind of performing them on a guitar, and then integrating a lot of cool loops and noise layers and stuff like that. That's pretty fun. Um, uh, Colin Marston's band,
Hmm.
Senethrak with Mick and Weasel Walter and Paulo. I like that one a lot. Uh, it's improvised brutal death metal basically, so it takes like the naturally gibberishy nature of brutal death metal and makes it actually random, which I that appeals to me. Obviously, as someone who also likes to play and hear random notes. Let's see what else. Boundaries of heavy metal. There's some other bands that are kind of in that style. Sort of like recent bands that are kind of spin-offs from what I think of as like sort of the core premise, at least of a Senethrak. There's this band Effluence that I think is it's one guy who is based in California, I want to say, um, who is doing something that's kind of in a similar, free music inflected, um, uh, but a very brutal like death metal style. But it's got some fusion elements. He does a lot more with production. There's like key layer. There's like keyboard and synth layers in it and stuff like that. It just has a little bit more of like a cut up kind of feel.
Hmm.
It reminds me a little bit of there's this band called Mulk, another band
Hmm.
that's they're a little bit older, but they are somewhere between uh like a gore grind band, like Last Days of Humanity or something like that. One of these like these ping kind of bands, right?
Hmm.
It's somewhere between like a very extreme ping band and like a very extreme form of techno, like speedcore, I think they call it
Or
sometimes,
like
where
Gabber or
it's very
something.
chopped up, like super like like yeah, it's like the stuff I'm thinking of is in like the neighborhood of Gabber or like a descendant of Gabber or something like that, and it's like super kinetic, like 200 300 BPM like electronic music, like
Hmm.
up and past like death metal and grindcore tempos. It also has this like very cut up sort of sample oriented sound. It's been Mulk, um, who are kind of I think of them as Effluence being in that neighborhood. There's another project like that that I think is probably related to Effluence in some way called Tantric Bile. That
Tantric
has
Bile. That's good.
it's a great band name too. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And they have a more of a explicit jazz influence, but it's like very sardonic and like sort of hateful towards jazz. It's pretty entertaining stuff. I mean, uh, to the extent that these bands are really like opening new vistas into what heavy metal can be, like, I think that when I first started making this kind of like, or working with people making these kind of like fringe, somewhat metal like, somewhat other kinds of things, um, sort of integrative music, I was, naively hopeful that it would like really, take off and such, because I was, 21, 22, and
Mhm.
that kind of thing seems possible at that time. And well, that hasn't happened. I will say that there is more of that kind of thing out there and available, at least to me, than there ever has been. Um, so to some degree, I think like the boundaries that I was interested in seeing broken have just like been broken now, and
Yeah.
like not that many people like it, and that's fine. Like, of course they don't, like, but that's it's been gratifying in that way, just to see that there's now a proliferation of this stuff. And of course the rise of Bandcamp has helped a lot with that. It's so much easier to distribute that kind of thing in a way that feels meaningful than it used to be. Back when, I'm 34, back in my teen years, if you wanted to find a super obscure thing, like record on the internet, you'd have to basically know the right people, or like, just like run the risk of getting a computer virus trying to find it.
Yep.
So
Soul
to me,
Seek.
it's, yeah, exactly, Soul Seek, or like, there's lots of people posting links to you send it uploads of zip files containing albums and forums and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, there's the whole torrenting thing, so there were ways to get it. And so in that sense, like the period of abundancy for that kind of music had already begun even then, but now it's just like so easy, and there's so like nicely presented, and like the quality's good. There's more bands like that than I ever thought there would be. So in some ways, I feel like, like the mission has been accomplished, not by me per se, but just like broadly speaking. So it's been nice to see in that way.
Cool, cool. I'm looking forward to checking out all these bands.
Yeah, I can follow up and like write with the names and everything. So
Um, what was I going to say here? I guess like metal, it seems like is largely becoming like a multimedia thing. Like, it's a great vehicle for composition, but also like there sort of has to be like cover art that has something going into it. There like generally is like apparel. Like I feel like the long sleeve tee is like a whole thing that's part of it. And like I know that y'all work with Caroline Harrison, kind of on a regular basis for your album covers. And so when like I'm sure that the lyrical content affects the sort of like theme of an album, but like I guess like how do you cultivate those themes and bring in Caroline and that type of thing?
well, so one piece of context that will probably be informative here is that Caroline's actually my partner.
Oh, okay.
We've been together for about as long as Pyrrhon has been around. We met shortly before the band formed. So she has really been along for every step of the way, and has, you know, witnessed the conceptual and aesthetic, sort of evolution of the band from the word go, literally. And I
Damn.
talked to her about, what I'm thinking creatively a lot. And she's an artist, so she understands like the way this process works. So yeah, like as a result of that, we've been able to collaborate with a level of closeness that I think it would be pretty uncommon in other circumstances. Um, and so it just kind of so happens that, I mean, I'm sure there's some mutual influence going on here, but it kind of just so happens that um, our creative work is compatible in this way, where it kind of made sense to plug her into this like sort of like, Ray Pettibon and Black Flag sort of role of
Mhm.
just like the house artist, who uh, essentially like designed and maintains the entire visual aesthetic of the band. I mean, we've had some t-shirt designs done by other artists and flyers and whatnot, but as far as the album covers and the vast majority of the merch, it's all been her. Um, and really, it's you know, there's not. It doesn't feel like work to do that, because we're talking about this stuff anyway. Um, and she is very receptive to input as far as the content of the pieces. I generally don't I try not to say too much about the implementation details because I don't want to backseat drive, and she knows so much more about it than I do. Um, Usually we kind of agree on a general direction for the thing, and she just lets it rip. And It's worked out really incredibly well for us. I think it's been such a boon for the band because really no one in the band has um, all that much of a visual flair. It's not something a lot of bands have, like some guy who's good at graphic design or whatever, or has a just at least like a really strong eye.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't say that any of us really have that. So it's been really an incredible resource and an incredible privilege to have someone who I trust so much, who understands exactly where we're coming from in a way that few people could, um, and who also has the entire context of the band. So even like it really comes out recently in some of the merch because as bands go on, like your merch just gets like dumber and dumber and just do sillier stuff because like like your ability to take yourself super seriously in that young metal band way just gets like
Mhm.
beaten out of you by life basically. So now that we're like kind of like making like just goofier merch and stuff like that, she just understands like the in band. She knows all the in jokes and everything, like
Mhm.
whenever we come home from tour, she has to listen to us all say all the in jokes for like months afterwards. So even she even like she knows us even on that level,
Nice.
and that means that she's been able to like do like funny, goofy shirts for us as well, like all the very serious, like stark, severe looking images that she's created for the band. And yeah, I don't know, it's like it's super handy. I because Pyrrhon is my first serious band. It's hard for me to imagine being in a scenario where that was just like a big gulf for the band we had to fill, or got like stuck with like some crappy generic art or whatever.
Mhm.
I think that to some degree, not to some degree, but like it's very clear to me that Pyrrhon would not be as well known if it wasn't for her art because it's so eye catching,
For sure.
and also like has such a strong, consistent aesthetic. From one album to the next, it really looks all like the images are radically different, but it all looks like the same hand, and that kind of thing, you know, to me is the visual aspect of a band that I prize more highly than anything else, more than or the way or t-shirt designs or the way that the band looks on stage, like costumes or stage dressing or all that stuff. Like, as a fan, when I think of a band's visual aesthetic, I always think of the album covers, even if they have something else that's like very um, busy and eye-catching going on. So it's really been something that we're just like very lucky to have for going for us.
Man, that's awesome. I'm jealous because my partner is also a visual artist, and I feel like it's a big deal to get her to do anything collaborative with me. But maybe just because we have differing aesthetics, she's not into heavy stuff like that. But um, in terms of I read somewhere that you didn't want to have like one of these sleek cyborg covers, and um, I get that. And like it's funny because with my project right now, like there's an underlying sort of cyborg uh, energy to it, I guess, where it's just like a little bit dorkier or like more mathy. And yeah, I guess I don't know what my question is here, but is there anything in that realm that you're into in death metal, like any sort of sleeker stuff?
Oh yeah, I mean for sure. There's lots of like sort of more polished looking and sounding bands that I like. I mean for your band, it makes perfect sense because the band, in some sense, literally is a machine, right? Or it's a machine that you're controlling, at least. So,
Hmm.
that whole look of like a slick, polished, like 3D rendered monster. There's lots of death metal that I like that has that look. I mean, a very obvious example, they don't have the monster thing, but very obvious like robot looking and sounding band that I like is Wormed, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And their lyrics are all about astronomy and particle physics and stuff like that, and like very very experimental kinds of math. So like it fits perfectly. Of course it makes sense. Meshuggah is like the robot band in some ways, and they have that. I love them. One of my favorite bands. In terms of death metal, it's not quite the same thing, but there was the computer generated era of Morbid Angel album covers. Like, there's like the Formula's Fatal to the Flesh album cover is like the most like 1998 looking shit imaginable. It's like this like video game like sort of like vector board at an angle, and there's like like a sphere, inevitably like a sphere, a 3D rendered sphere that has like a dragon coming out of it, a dragon made of fire or something like that. Um, and there's also all like the classic Dan Seagrave covers with the hyper detailed thing, like the Suffocation, Effigy of the Forgotten cover has a robot on it. But it's like a trash robot. It's in a trash heap. I don't know. Like I mean, like, I'm not immune to the charms of that kind of like
Mhm.
sort of lighthearted and like very like crisp and detailed like science fiction or fantasy like book cover illustration imagery. I grew up on that stuff, so it's definitely part of why I was able to segue into being like a death metal fan at a young age, because that kind of aesthetic is so pervasive in science fiction and fantasy, which I was like very familiar with as a kid, being a little nerd. Um,
Mhm.
and so when I come across that stuff later on, I was like, oh, like I'm right at home. It's a Magic the Gathering card or whatever. And so I don't object to it. It's just not really what I'm going for. And there was also this period in the late like 20 aughts, like 2000, like 6 to 9 or 10, where basically all of the death metal that was um, musically ambitious in any way, especially in terms of technique. I don't want to say technical because we just
Right.
poo-poo the
Yeah.
shit out of that, but like,
Totally.
but yeah, so like, there was just kind of a flood of those sort of bands with that exact aesthetic, and it was often this sequence of interchangeable computer rendered, very lens flary monsters in the covers of the albums. And at the time, I was a music blogger. I did a lot of like music blogging from like 2005 through like 2015 or 17 or so. And so I was writing lots and lots of album reviews, and I was specializing in death metal. So I was like getting just like dozens of these albums all the time. And so I came to have a pretty negative association with how they looked for a while, and just felt like I was being oppressed by this like flood of these like tech death monster covers.
Mhm.
So I mean, I was probably just talking a little shit when I said that in the interview, but I don't really have any serious objection to it or anything. It's just like not what it's not what would be appropriate for any of my projects. So
Gotcha. Yeah, I was listening to the inalienable. I can't ever say it. The inalienable dreamless discordance axis.
yeah, yeah.
Difficult word, but I mean the fucking blue skies on the cover. Like what? It does not
Well,
support the
that
music.
the funny thing about that one is that it actually is in some way like an album that would be extremely appropriate to have a high def monster of some kind, because a lot of the lyrics are inspired by Neon Genesis Evangelion, the mecha
Mm.
anime, like the very like Freudian or like Lacanian, I guess, mecha anime. And so there actually is like stuff that would be accurately represented by a giant robot monster on that record. I actually have a copy of that album coming on vinyl pretty soon. It's one of my favorite records,
Nice.
but
Yeah, it's great.
um, yeah, but definitely some uh, slightly, to me, discontinuous lyrical content of that one. I do really like that those albums, all the Discord Access albums, came in like DVD cases, or I guess they're supposed to be maybe like PS2 or like PlayStation
Mm.
game cases. I know that that guy's a big gamer too. Um, but yeah, when you buy them back in the day, the CD would come in like a, like the book shaped black plastic cases that old
Yeah.
video games would come in. Yeah, I thought that
Um,
was fun.
I've never seen a physical version of the album. I've always just had the digital stuff. Um, but Pyrrhonism, where the band name I guess sort of comes from, is some sort of philosophical skepticism, and I'm big into sort of the world of skepticism. And first of all, I was wondering if you could explain Pyrrhonism, and second, your relationship with skepticism and that type of stuff.
Yeah, I can give a very cursory layman's explanation of what Pyrrhonism is. It's a very early form of skepticism, as I understand it. Like potentially, like he often gets the Pyrrhon the philosopher, who's also, I think, more frequently in English known as Pyrrho rather than Pyrrhon. I think the Pyrrhon is it's used in French and maybe Turkish a lot, but he's often called Pyrrho in English. He was one of these Socrates type figures who didn't write anything, so his teachings are known through the writings of his disciples. And his specific brand of skepticism was extraordinarily radical, and uh, as I understand it, he really also walked the walk. He would like literally walk around town, not believing that things around him were real. Um, and so his followers would kind of like scurry after him and keep him from like falling down hills and stuff like that. But yeah, his famous he's got some famous maxim though, something along the lines of like nothing can be proven, not even this, which is like
Mm,
a fun like sort of um, sort of almost like a presaging of like an incompleteness theorem or something like that, right? But I don't really know his work super well. First of all, there's not very much of it. He's like again, he's mostly known by reputation, as I understand it. But I also like I'm not really. We didn't choose the band name because we were purporting to be adherents to his school of thought.
mhm.
It was something that we kind of backed into basically, where we, at the time that we were naming the band, it was the usual like hellish band naming process when there's like a democratic setup, no one could agree, blah, blah. We were all like 20 and just kind of like,
Yeah.
like throwing like, death metal sounding words around. And my recollection is the way that it worked is that um, the phrase Pyrrhic victory came up. We thought that was too much of a mouthful, and so we kind of cast about in the neighborhood and came up with the name Pyrrhon. At the time, my recollection is I was like barely familiar with who he was at all. I was in college. I did study philosophy in college, but I wasn't very familiar with the man of the hour. So I kind of just like Wikipedia'd him and like looked and I was like, this guy seems like a crazy figure. That fits. And then as far as my personal relationship with skepticism, uh, I wouldn't call myself a skeptic in the strict philosophical sense. Um, I do think that it's a thematically appropriate name for the band, though, just in the sense that a lot of the thematic content deals with um, things not being what they seem, things not being real in the sense that you're led to believe that they're real, um, sort of hidden aspects of the world as it actually exists, um, and just kind of like the sense of a veil, the sense of being deceived by the face of things around you. Um, uh, in those ways, I think it actually like kind of hit the nail on the head for what the band is about, in a very like high level, like basic premises way.
Mm.
But it's definitely not meant to be taken too literally as a denotation of like what our perspective in the world is or what our philosophy is or anything like that.
Gotcha. So when you say you studied philosophy, was that like your main thing, or was that just one of the things that you were studying?
It was yeah, I had an interdisciplinary major. It was a kind of a common one, philosophy, politics, and economics. I focused on mostly ethical philosophy, political theory. Um, I kind of like did a little econ, but not very much because I found pretty quickly that I didn't like it very much. But yeah, so basically, it was effectively a law school feeder program at my school, and my intention was to become a lawyer, which I abandoned part of the way through college as I came to realize that I would hate it and didn't really believe in the American legal system very much, and also just generally became a little bit more despairing about the medium term prospects of our civilization, and so embarking on a career path where you don't get anything good to happen to you for the first 25 years didn't seem very appealing to me. Um, so that went down the tubes, but I did learn about some interesting figures in the process.
Are there any sort of like philosophers that you value more than others? And I'm curious if you have any takes on Daniel Dennett, just because he's somewhat, my band's namesake.
Yeah, I'm only vaguely familiar with him, so I don't really have a good take that I can rattle off other than like he's good. That's
Okay,
my
that's
take.
fair. That's good
Yeah,
to
yeah.
hear.
I don't want to speak out of turn on that. Um, I feel like my philosophy education got a little bogged down early on, and I found myself just like working through a series of mostly like classical liberals and democratic theorists that I um, find myself eventually stridently disagreeing with.
Mm.
Um, and I never really found anyone who I would consider to be like too relatable of a figure in that world. And in general, I find myself frustrated by my lack of ability to derive like powerful insights from it. So I kind of like broke up with philosophy actually at the end of college, and kind of haven't really returned to it very much as an adult. It's helpful to know the basics for understanding like the pragmatic details of the society that we're living in, because uh, strangely, philosophers, even 20th century philosophers, have been very influential. Um, but I've always struggled to really um, embrace one of them, I guess is the term that I'm looking for. I can't say who I like.
Hmm. That's
Like
fine.
it's hard for me to give a good answer to that question in that way.
Gotcha. You aren't waving anybody's flag or anything.
No, I wish. I mean, it seems like that was what I always wanted was, a system to live by.
Hmm.
And then I kept on finding that these people were miserable and incredibly dysfunctional. And I thought how valuable, I mean, like obviously like, like a trivial way to object to it, but I really did find myself often thinking like, you know, what's the point if you're more tortured by the level of understanding that you've achieved?
Hmm.
Um, like what does that give you? And so many of them did seem to be, there's so many philosophers seem to be pretty unhappy people, so.
Yeah, it seems fair. So in terms of like ethics and aesthetics, I feel like they're both like these ways of assessing like value and that type of thing. And I know that some of these reviews were saying that where am I going with this? Some of these reviews were saying basically like that Pyrrhon is calling out edge lords, and like I saw that you said like a lot of metal is problematic, and I'm curious what you would like to see because like there's plenty of horrific shit to talk about that's quote metal instead of like the sort of campy, gory like stuff, and I'm wondering if that type of stuff bothers you at all, and if you'd like to see it like the whole like world move from that, and if so, like what to or what would you like to see metal like sort of grow into
Um,
in terms of content and
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, metal is like it's easy to say it's easy to talk about metal at a high level as though it's a monolithic thing, but it's not. It's like
Mhm.
very like decentral. Like it's as decentralized as a culture can really get because it's basically the kind of metal that we're discussing here. Is mostly like underground metal, and that stuff is really driven entirely by grassroots energy. Like
Totally,
there's
yeah.
not there's an industry around it, but the industry is like you know um, basically like a bottom feeder, for lack of a better term. Like there's
Mhm.
not really very much money. Um, so people ultimately are going to do what they want. Metal in particular is pretty. It has like a pretty strong conservative streak. I mean, there's kind of countervailing pressures to be like um, exploratory and free and radical versus like all the weird like national like masculine traditionalism of metal.
Mhm.
Um, so like to some degree I just kind of have accepted that stuff's never going to go away. It's just part of the genre. And there's also, sort of a like this kind of like wrestling like sort of like carny thing going on with metal, where it's like it's supposed to be like schlocky. People often like it because it's schlocky and because the stakes are low and because it's bright lights and big gestures and all that stuff. So like to some degree, like that's all just there. It's never going to go away. That too is what metal is. But the reason that I was drawn to it is its ability to just like tap into and sort of artistically process like really disturbing stuff about the world, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Which is something that it shares with a lot of with punk and with hip hop and with many other like sort of grassroots underground music styles, is that it can like look at things in an unflinching way. Um, and generally speaking, the kinds of metal that I like the best, or at least like the bands that I like the best, have a way of doing that. Even when you look at like Metallica, the most popular metal band, people by and large agree that the best Metallica records are their early material, where they're often addressing like pretty hard facts about actual like real life reality, um, and the same goes for a lot of the material on like Radiant Blood, right? Or a lot of the Black Sabbath material was like pretty explicitly like social political in nature, and So, I wouldn't ever say that like metal should always be addressing serious adult themes about the real world because that's just it's not what it
Right.
is. Like that's not going to happen. Um, I do think that there's a lot of like very rote, repetitive, boring imagery in metal. The zombies, the demons, the
Hmm.
witches, the Satan. Like all that stuff. Like, like or the gore, right? Like the woman getting chainsawed in half, blah blah, right? Like that stuff. Like it's it was transgressive and disquieting at the time that these genres were born, but now it's like rote and pandering and like comforting in a way. Like it's like, oh look, like I know exactly what this band's gonna sound like based on the nature of like the album art and like the specific beats that it's hitting, and like I can know it's gonna be like a replica of this type of band from this era of the band based on just the presentation alone. And you know it's not for me to yuck anyone's yum. That's what some people want
Hmm.
is to be pandered to in that way. But to me, that's like really not what it's about, and really
Right.
not what draws me still to this music. Is I want to I do still want to be like shocked, and I don't necessarily in a purulent way. I don't need to see like more extreme gore. I just want something that will surprise me and like make me think about what's going on around me and make me sort of wonder how they thought to do that, right? Like that was what was crazy about that stuff at the time. It wasn't like there was the subject matter itself was transgressive, but also like the thought of like doing a band about something like that was was wild, right? Like
Hmm.
and new. Um, and a lot of for me the value of these kinds of spaces it allows you to do this crazy new stuff like those bands we were discussing earlier like like Affluence and Tantric Bile and Incenithrak and Jukite like that shit's new, no one's ever done that before,
Hmm.
like, and to me that is, even if it doesn't appeal to very many people, that has a great deal of value because what's interesting about the world and like what makes it worth continuing to experience day after day is the novelty of it.
Hmm.
It's being it's especially when it comes to aesthetic experiences. It's like feeling yourself be changed by something that you encounter is like really incredibly powerful and really what like draws me to the world of art in general, not just music. um, and so when I see bands that are like obviously very talented musicians and have a very high level of proficiency what they're doing and a great deal of control, and they're using it to uh, play repertoire basically. Like playing repertoire that's not dishonorable or anything like that, but especially in a space like metal, it's like supposedly not about repertoire. It's about
Hmm.
tearing people a new one. Basically, it's like, we'll
Totally.
tear the new one then instead. Don't just revisit someone else's past success from an era that at this point, like a lot of people doing that don't remember the original like wave of death
Totally.
metal. I don't remember the original. Like, I mean, I remember being like a 4 year old and like my friend's older brothers like he like being into Cannibal Corpse or whatever. But I don't even remember like what it was like when those bands started appearing, especially like or the thrash stuff was happening before I was born. Like, and that's the other thing is that like if you're gonna be making this highly idiosyncratic, like very low commercial ceiling kind of music,
Yeah.
at least make it your own. Like why would you take your opportunity to do that and spend it um, reenacting something? For me, that's just not for me. And art that's like that mostly isn't for me. Sometimes I am like, oh well, this is like, it is a recapitulation of something, but it's so good that like I'm like, I'm not totally immune to it, but like, in metal especially, there's so many like of these identikit kind of bands that are just very carefully honing what they're doing to be an imitation of something else. And like, it just makes me say like why like
Yeah.
obviously I just don't I can't relate to it, and I often find it unsatisfying, and a lot of the most popular stuff just is that, so like I'm constantly facing it. So I've got a bit of a chip on my shoulder about it sometimes, but I also at the same time accept that just is the nature of metal to some degree. So
Hmm.
is it ever going to change? Like no, it's never going to change, but you can try to in your own practice do something different, and you can try to support and endorse and encourage other bands that you think are doing something different. You don't have to settle for Cannibal Corpse number 9,000. So
Right. Well, I mean, that's definitely a sentiment that I can agree with, and yeah, I mean, it's all about the novelty and pushing into something new and interesting. But anyway, it's getting late over there for you, so I want to just wrap up with a stupid question. I know that you have been voted the sexiest man in metal, and I'm sure that you don't like that being brought up, but on video here for those that are just listening, you got luscious locks here. I'm just curious, for a first time long hair man. You can't see it; it's up. But what's a good hair care regimen?
A good hair care regimen. Well, you should wash it and condition it. You should also try to comb it out a couple times a week, just so it gets all tangled up and stuff. That's pretty much all I do, honestly. I try to eat healthy food. I don't really know. Like, actually, at the time of that very fair and not at all manipulated by bots contest that I won. I actually didn't even have long hair yet, so it's possible that my more generic metal guy look would not have achieved victory in that. So be careful what you wish for too.
So you aren't one of these no poo movement guys?
What? A what?
The like no shampoo,
Oh no, okay. I think you said
not
no
shitting, but
poo. I was like, whoa, that's really extreme for the purposes of hair. No, I pretty much shampoo my hair like every other day, I guess. You shouldn't do it every day because it strips all the oils off your hair, I guess, and makes your hair kind of dry. But like honestly, I probably am doing it too much until my hair. Caroline, my dear partner, has told me that my hair is dry, and I've said like, cool, I don't know what to do about that, and I'm not going to do anything. So. Yeah, I'd just say like grow it out while you have it. I also had like super short hair for a long time, and everyone thought that I was bald because I was like shaving it so close that people thought that it was because I had male pattern baldness, and I had to prove all the haters wrong. So and now I've done that. And it's very gratifying stuff.
cool. Insider tips on hair care. Cool. Well, I'll let you get out of here. Thanks for talking. It's been cool. Do you want to like plug anything? Any websites or anything?
Any stuff. Yeah, so you can find Pyrrhon's music on Bandcamp, Pyrrhon Band at bandcamp.com. Sepitus is sepitus.bandcamp.com. I have another project where I play guitar called Weeping Sores. That's I think it's I'm not sure whatever Bandcamp is. Let me check. Yeah, it's weepingsores.bandcamp.com. And then I actually have a new project that's being announced pretty shortly. So keep an eye out for a new band that I'm in that the world will know about soon. That will be, I think, of interest to people who listen to this podcast. It's kind of a shame that we couldn't talk about it actually, because I think you would have liked it. But
Oh shit.
maybe I can come back.
Yeah, you're always welcome back. Cool. Well, I think I also introduced you wrong by saying that you were the singer in Weeping Sores. That's incorrect. Sounds like.
Oh no, I do also do the vocals with
Okay.
Scores, and there is another band called Glorious Depravity. That's another death metal band that I'm in where I'm doing the vocals. So it's getting hard to keep track of. So I try to just roll with the ones that are presented to me.
Cool. Well, maybe another time we'll resume this at a better hour. But I'll let you get out of here. Thanks so much for talking, man. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, man, that was fun. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. See you.
All right, take care.